Hello everybody, welcome back, or welcome in if it is your first time here. Hi, my name is Beck Griffin and this is the Deep Dive Project, which is my independent citizen journalistic venture in bearing witness to, archiving, and attempting to raise some awareness over some of the insanity that we are currently living through. If it is your first time here, I would love it if you subscribed. Of course, give this video a thumbs up regardless, and maybe share it with someone that you know. If it is your first time here, there are a few things that I want to make sure that you know going in. First and foremost is that there's a content warning with every single episode, every single video that I publish. There's a very real chance that some, if not all, of what we discuss could be distressing to some members of the public, so viewer discretion is advised. The second thing is that I always cite my sources, so you can find the source document for everything that we're going to be going over today linked in the description of this video. Feel free to check it out. And then lastly, I am not a journalist by trade, and I want to make very sure and point that out now because I think it's pretty important. I have an academic background, I have an environmental science background, I have a military background as a US veteran, but I'm not a journalist by trade. In fact, I'm just like you, a concerned member of the public who stumbled upon something that at that time nobody really seemed to be discussing, and I couldn't sit on that and not do something about that. I'm the kind of person who becomes convicted by injustice, and I want to see justice for victims. It's just the kind of person that I am. So when I came upon this stuff, I had to start talking about it, and 6 years later, it definitely feels like I was pulling on a pretty important thread. Of course, at the time, I could never imagine that what I stumbled upon would end up becoming so pertinent, particularly for my own country, which, given the times that we are living in, feels like something worth mentioning. But I may be getting ahead of myself. If you've never been here before, please familiarize yourself with the entire catalog of work that I have over on my channel, and you can listen to this on Spotify and most places that podcasts live as well. Please leave a review if you do listen there. Before this intro gets any longer, let's try to move this forward into what brings us here today. So what you are watching is a newsroom analysis, which is something that I began doing at the beginning of last year, where I gather headlines that were published over the prior month that are relevant to the stuff that I research, and I read through them, give you my opinion and perspective on them, and we discuss. So that is what we are going to be doing today. We're going to be looking at the articles for the month of January. So this is the first newsroom analysis of 2026, and I am happy to be continuing to do this because it's something that I got a lot of value out of over the last year, and it seemed like a lot of you guys did too. So I'm happy to be continuing to do this. Now, with that being said, because of the times that we are living through and the heaviness of everything that is happening in our world, before I get to the more topical news articles, I want to take a moment to pause and acknowledge what is happening, particularly in my country, the United States, and to take a moment to acknowledge the loss of life, the completely preventable loss of life, and the complete injustice that is being perpetrated by ICE. I have so many thoughts about this. My heart feels so incredibly heavy, and rather than meandering my way through some sort of a heartfelt expression, I am going to take a moment to read some words that I wrote a couple of weeks ago. They were published on my Substack, Beck Griffin and the Deep Dive Project, which you can subscribe to for free if you would like to support me over there. I felt like I couldn't say anything more, write anything more. I couldn't even look at anything pertaining to the niche that I research without taking a moment to acknowledge the broader human rights crisis that we're living through right now. And so if you would just give me a moment, I want to read my words to you now, and you can skip through this if you don't care to listen to what I have to say, but this is something that I feel like I need to say, so thank you for giving me the opportunity to do so now. So I published this article on my Substack on January 23rd, and I titled it, America, America, Don't Look Away, with the subheading, quote, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final and most essential command," which is a quote from George Orwell, 1984. And if you haven't read that book, now may not be the best time, but if we live through this and get to the other side, you really should. January 2026 has been the longest month of my life. I have trudged steadily on, head dutifully bowed, telling myself that the best thing that I can possibly do right now as my country devolves into a hellscape is to keep doing what I have been doing all along. I've kept reminding myself that human rights violations have been ongoing since the beginning of time, and that a sudden collective awareness of that fact, more unavoidable now as screams and ammunition fire ricochet from American suburbia, doesn't mean that it has not always been so. But horror is a matter of proximity to terror. I have felt a cold, creeping horror settling deeper and deeper into my body with each passing day and each new headline detailing the latest stunts pulled by ICE goons in masks. What can I say? In America, it is a sin to be right too soon. And so, over the past several decades, reports of children separated and kept in cages in detention facilities near the southern border, and some of those children subsequently going missing from those cages, never to be seen again, of brutal and inhumane treatment of migrants, men, women, and children, of a wide variety of constitutional violations and human rights abuses, and of an immigration system that had clearly failed long ago and should be totally overhauled, were downplayed, satirized, and out denied. I watched it my entire childhood and young adult life. And I have a sickly feeling that in the years ahead, there will be those who will say, with hands thrown up in exasperation, why didn't somebody do something? I grew up reading books like The Diary of Anne Frank, The Book Thief, and The Light in Hidden Places. Stories about people forced into taking desperate measures to survive against an authoritarian regime that sent soldiers house to house, searching, taking, and exterminating those they deemed undesirable and subhuman. I know and understand how these things happen, because I know and understand history. And I have watched countless historians, journalists, activists, and survivors attempt to raise the alarm year after year after year, while the majority of the people around me, with lockjawed determination, have looked away, seeking their next distraction. I cannot go on as if nothing has happened and as if nothing is real. I cannot behave as if I have not seen this storyline before and as if I have no inkling of where it leads. I won't write or speak another word about religious oppression and abuse, about Opus Dei or the Legion of Christ or that snake Chad Ripperger or anyone else without first acknowledging what is happening in my country. Because when I read those stories growing up, I was never under any illusion as to how I would behave and what I would do if such terrible things should come to my door. And now America is hemorrhaging from a sucking chest wound high and hard over the state of Minnesota, and the bloodstain is spreading. My intuition was a whisper, but now it is a scream. I know this feeling because it is the exact same feeling that I had a couple of weeks ago in the moments following my realization that I was being stalked through a park by 3 men intent on forcing me into a bottleneck and assaulting me. Things are nearly as bad as they can be, and the window of opportunity to save ourselves shrinks by the second. When you know, you know. A ball of steel has settled into my sternum. Time is slowed down, and each and every word and action that I have seen has played out in slow motion. Boots stamp across snow-packed curbs, around vehicles and people worked into a frenzy as tires squeal and the long arm of immunized authoritarianism leans over, beyond the edge of steel-toed feet well out of harm's way, annihilating American exceptionalism with the pull of a trigger. The vision of those nanoseconds play on a loop through my mind over and over and over again. There is a deep knowing within me that what we are seeing is bad work. It goes beyond my intuition. For example, I can spot bad police work because I was a federal law enforcement agent for the better part of a decade. A competent, well-trained law enforcement officer would never do what I saw ICE agents do the day that they murdered Renee Nicole Good, and what I have seen them doing before and after. What I have witnessed has been the epitome of sloppy, careless incompetency. Not only are these agents endangering the public and trampling over our inalienable rights because they were not wrong as long as they were following orders, but they are also putting their fellow agents in danger, apparently heedless of where their buddies are as the muzzles of their weapons rake back and forth over masked forms and smoke and tear gas fly. And that is very telling. I have gone through extensive training on and experienced everything from high-risk traffic stops to active shooter hostage situations, emergency vehicle operations, traffic accidents, alcohol-related incidents, including DUI checkpoints, domestic violence and fights in progress de-escalation, and basic anti-terrorism force protection, all while usually in teams of people armed to the teeth. I was also a field training officer responsible for overseeing the education and preparation of people who I knew would be interacting with the public while armed. It is my opinion that you can determine how competent an officer or agent is by how well they can do the bare bones basics of law enforcement: interacting with the public and traffic enforcement, crowd control. It takes time and repetition to gain competency. Knowing how pitifully short the training periods that these agents have had, it is literally impossible for them to have received even a fraction of the training that I did. But I knew that when I saw the footage. These men are not moving like competent professionals, but they badly want and need to be perceived that way. Bullies tend to be like that. What is happening in my country is incredibly unjust and will be a permanent stain on a history pockmarked by a legacy of similar violations. During World War II, it was not just the Nazis that pulled people from their homes and detained them in concentration camps. The United States did that too. And while the collective decision has been to forget and move on, I have not forgotten, and I never will. I am aware of how small and insignificant I am on the grand scale of things, and that I have absolutely no power to change the history we are doomed to repeat. But I will bear witness, and in my self-appointed role as an archivist and independent citizen journalist, I am duty-bound to say so publicly. It is impossible to condone any of this. I certainly won't. And as an American veteran who raised her right hand and swore to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, who carried a gun and a badge and the knowledge that I could end a life, who understood who I was protecting and why, I am revolted and heartbroken. The behavior of ICE and those in government enabling the defending and the actions of The behavior of ICE and those in government enabling and defending ICE's actions are shameful and wholly unconscionable on every level. Are you paying attention? Because I am. Opus Dei Pax. The way of peace is justice. Along with that, I want to read the names of the people who have been murdered so far. This is from the American Prospect. This was published January 29th and updated February 2nd. A running count of how many people ICE has killed and injured. Jamie Alanis, Roberto Carlos Montoya Valdez, Silvero Villegas Gonzalez, Jose Castro Rivera, Isaiah Sanchez Barboza, Keith Porter, Renee Good, Alex Preddy. Eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord. So, With that said, I'm going to move forward with the full awareness of what is happening, that human rights in my country and really around the world are under attack as much so as they have ever been, if not more. But I do truly believe that knowledge is power. The truth will set us free. That there are more of us than there are of them. And that if we can link arms over a common cause, the good and safety and well-being of our fellow man, then we can probably make a lot of really positive changes. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and move into our first article here from the last month, the official segment of the Newsroom analysis. So a lot of these articles are pulled from Latin or Spanish or just non-English sites from non-English speaking countries, because with the Newsroom analysis, I am not only pulling from American or Western English speaking sources, I'm pulling from all around the world because I try to take a very broad kind of perspective to really get a feel of the forest for the trees. And I feel like we've learned some really interesting things about the kind of currents that are moving in our world right now, socially and politically. So this is an article that was published on Los Andes 142 Latin site. This was published January 2nd, 2026 by entertainment staff. So with translating these articles from the language of origin to English, oftentimes there will be weird kind of grammatical things that get messed up. The genders and that kind of thing will get messed up because obviously Spanish and other languages have a different way of structuring their sentences and have like gendered language in a way that English doesn't as much. So I have to read around some of these things, and bear with me as I do that, but I think we'll still get the picture of what's going on. So the headline here says, Ale LaCroix's harrowing confession about the abuse he suffered during his adolescence, a way to heal. The renowned DJ, in conversations with Andy Kusnoff, revealed the details of the traumatic event he suffered at age 16. So renowned DJ and cultural manager Ale LaCroix publicly revealed the traumatic abuse he suffered during his adolescence, a secret he kept hidden for over 3 decades. In an interview on the program Perros de la Calle Urbana Play, hosted by Andy Kustensoff, my apologies for mispronouncing last names, he recounted in detail the events that marked his life beginning when he was 16 years old. So this is the account of a person who was abused as a teen. You're going to find out why I zeroed in on this story really quickly. The revelation comes amid a profound personal transformation LaCroix is undergoing, which includes overcoming addictions and adopting extreme discipline. Central themes of his book, A Beautiful Folly, from the endless party to the samurai of discipline. The abuser, as he described it, was a trusted figure of authority within his close family circles, presented as a mentor, a member of the same yacht club, and linked to Opus Dei. This position allowed him access in a power dynamic that culminated in the abuse. So if you've seen any of my recent work, you will know that I have been focusing on and looking into the situation of alleged child abuse within Opus Dei. It is my opinion that there is a problem within the organization for the simple reason that, unfortunately, predators and child abuse, as we are all becoming acquainted with and reminded of now, they exist through all strata of our society, from the top all the way to the bottom. And so, of course, there are going to be people like that in this organization. It just stands to reason. And based on what we are learning from the Epstein files, which have been blowing everyone's minds, it's very, very possible that at a certain level within most organizations, including religious ones, it's pedophiles all the way to the top. That seems to be what's coming out. Anyway, I'll read on. During the interview, LaCroix's voice broke several times. With his gaze lowered and pausing frequently, he recounted the events. He offered to accompany me. We started going to the club's showers, and little by little, the abuse began, he recalled. In a particularly painful passage, he quoted the words the man said to him, "Hey, if you want, watch me masturbate." I was young, and I didn't understand if it was right or wrong. Given the graphic nature of the account, host Andy intervened, telling him that he didn't need to tell the whole story. LaCroix continued explaining how the situation escalated. It was getting worse and worse. Luckily, at one point, I woke up and said, "Dude, this is enough." I don't know where it should have ended if I hadn't woken up. The development of his testimony included an analysis of the power dynamics in these crimes. LaCroix emphasized that despite the years, the perpetrator retained a psychological influence over him. Psychologically, they have power over you. And my psychologist explained to me that the chosen one has an ego that's incredibly twisted. He stated, this control manifested itself in a chance encounter when he was already an adult. He was big. I could have beaten him to a pulp, but he had that power that marks you for life, he confessed. In that tense confrontation, the abuser snapped at him, "You know who I am." LaCroix's response was unequivocal. "Yes, the son of a bitch who abused me." One of the most shocking revelations was that the man was later convicted of other crimes. I found out that his wife had left him because he abused a nephew with Down syndrome. It's getting worse and worse. And he's a volunteer at Children's Hospital, LaCroix stated, adding that the man was sentenced to life imprisonment. However, he recounted with astonishment that 3 months after his sentencing, I ran into him free. I mean, how many times have we seen this happen? And especially if you are following or are in any way paying attention to what the Epstein files, the redacted, sloppily, hastily redacted and released files that have been coming out, what they have to say about the behavior of people like this. I mean, this tracks completely. So much of the correspondence, for example, between Epstein and other people were about PR, about maintaining an image, about how to salvage his image, about how to spin certain controversies and scandals so that they would paint him in the most favorable light possible. And one of the ways that they do that is through philanthropy, by making themselves out to be these incredibly generous and philanthropic and civic-minded people who are just there to give their money to the people because they've been so blessed with all of this abundance in their life, and they're just giving it back, and isn't it so nice? And when people do those kinds of things, there's a sort of innate tendency in us, I think, to be reluctant to consider the motivations behind why someone's doing that. It's that whole expression, don't look a gift horse in the mouth, right? It's like you don't want to question too hard why someone is doing something like this. And so it ends up being another layer of protection to the predator, which is just, it's crazy. And then to say that the man was sentenced to life, but then somehow ran into him. I mean, it's a tale as old as time, honestly. I am so happy that it is becoming more and more possible for victims of abuse, of a range of abuse, whether it's CSA or clerical abuse, spiritual abuse, any type, domestic, whatever, that it's becoming more possible for people to talk about their experiences. Sometimes not even in a sense of where it's to go after justice, but just to raise awareness about how these things happen, about how perpetrators and predators can ingratiate themselves to a victim's family, can groom the victim's family and the victim themselves into believing they're these good people. All of these different facets that go into the very complex issue that is just abuse in general. When you start adding in things like influence and power and money into it, it becomes even more complex. But we're finally starting to have those conversations, and a lot of people are being forced to contend with the reality of things in a way that they were really avoiding for a long time. My greatest hope is that this is not something that is brushed under the rug, any of this stuff. With the awareness that is being brought to abuse of human rights and how they are manifest and perpetuated, I hope that it isn't brushed under the rug. I hope that this becomes these conversations are the early precursors to better, more broad, more complete conversations that can lead to things like policy to protect people in our society, to deal with people who are predatory and use systems in our societies that are supposed to be there to help people to be bottom feeders, to be disgusting leeches on society. That is what my hope is. And it's another reason why I talk about this stuff. I don't enjoy talking about this stuff, but I think it's important. And I think we need to be having conversations about it. We need to be bringing this stuff into the public as much as possible. With that said, here's a perfect example. So this is from Infobae from Spain, published at the end of January 22nd. New cases of pedophilia emerged in the church following the agreement between the government and the bishops. The Stolen Children's Association, encourages victims of sexual abuse to give their testimony at this time, since if they do not now, they probably will never be able to testify about a prescribed crime. So this is written by Maria Garcia Areneles, and we'll read through some of it here. The signing of the agreement between the government and the Catholic Church on January 8th, which will create a new way through the Ombudsman for the reparation of victims of sexual abuse in the ecclesiastical environment, has been a turning point for many victims and more those who decide to take the step and seek justice. After years of silence following this pact, associations of survivors of these abuses have received new testimonies. In 15 days, 11 new cases have arrived at the association, which shows that there were people who were waiting for such an agreement to take place to be repaired and recognized. And I have no doubt that in the coming months, we will be called by more people to expose their abuses. I'm going to guess I don't think that word translated very well. This is a quote that was attributed to Juan Cuatracasas, president of the Association of Stolen Children's ANIR. Most of the testimonies, which correspond to men who were abused during their childhood by priests and members of religious orders, had already appeared before the Ombudsman, although the victims had not directly contacted ANIR. However, Cuatracasas clarifies 3 of these cases had not been transferred to the agency led by Angel Gabilondo. While collecting all the cases received, the victims' associations remain waiting for the authorities to explain in detail the functioning and criteria of action of the new plan of care and advice agreed between the state and the church. Quote, "We know that there was a month to sign the agreement. We will collect all the calls that move us so that we can advise them conveniently," says Cuatracasas, whose son suffered sexual abuse by Jose Maria Martinez Sanz, a member and teacher of an Opus Dei school in Bilbao between 2008 and 2010. I've talked about this case quite a bit in the past. The president of ANIR appeals to those who have suffered sexual abuse in the ecclesiastical field to be encouraged to give their testimony. He insists that this is a key moment for the victims, since if they do not speak now, they probably can never ever testify to a prescribed crime. It also emphasizes that it is a right and not a concession. It's a great opportunity. They're demanding their rights, and they have the possibility to start a path so that they can free all their pain and their human trauma. This is not an alms, as many members of the church claim. The agreement signed on January 8th between the Ministry of Justice, the Spanish Bishops' Conference, and the Spanish Conference of Religious, which came forward after a complex negotiation and thanks to the impulse of the Vatican, establishes an extrajudicial mechanism of attention, recognition, and compensation for those who suffered abuses in the environment of the church and have been deprived of access to criminal justice, mainly because of the prescription of crimes. The Ombudsman will review each case and propose a form of reparation, whether symbolic, restorative, spiritual, or economic, as requested by the person concerned. If the proposal is accepted by both parties, the church will make the compensation. In the event that there is no agreement, a commission composed of victims, church, and state will seek a solution. If no agreement is reached in that committee, the Ombudsman's decision will prevail according to the government. The executive has also confirmed that compensation to the victims will be paid by the church. These compensations will be exempt from income tax and will be retroactive. So it will be interesting to see how all of this ends up shaking out and down, especially for people who are coming forward saying that they were victimized, asking for some type of reparation or assistance. This seems like a really positive thing, though, even if it's not a perfect system, even if there are things that need to be changed and amended, and it seems that's just the way that it goes. We have to start somewhere, and it's good to see the Spanish Catholic Church contending with this. This is following on the heels of news coverage that I saw all last year about the Archdiocese of Madrid, specifically talking a lot about spiritual abuse. They had released a video, you can find it on YouTube, talking about like a short little 3-minute video talking about spiritual abuse, what it is, how it manifests, what to be done about it. So it does seem like there's a growing awareness of the fact that, for better or for worse, even though these are apparently holy institutions, they've been pretty thoroughly infiltrated by some really unsavory, predatory people. And the victims deserve to be taken care of because they were drawn into the church under certain pretenses, under certain beliefs, and they trusted the church members that they interacted with, the people who ended up abusing them. It's a very complex thing, but they deserve to be taken care of. They deserve to be acknowledged, at the very least. To have their stories heard and acknowledged is really, really important. That can be such a major first step in healing for so many victims of abuse, is just the ability to share what happened to them. It's one of the reasons why online communities like Opus Libris and Opus Dei Exposed are so successful, because there are people who have had experiences that they need to get out, and they need to talk, and they need to try to figure out what happened to them with other people who've been through similar things. Survivor communities and that kind of thing are really, really important. And I hope that this is a positive step in a positive direction. I hope that this builds on itself going forward. All right, next article. So if you saw my newsroom analysis from December, or if you saw, I clipped this segment as well, and I'll clip this as well to a standalone video. I introduced you last month to the weird and wacky world of celebrity exorcists, celebrity Catholic exorcists. I have to make sure that I specify, because I think evangelical Christianity has exorcists, and they can engage in like exorcism type activities, I guess, for lack of a better term. I'm specifically talking about Catholic exorcism here, and the weird world of celebrity exorcists, which is thriving, alive, and well here in the United States and elsewhere, I am sure. And unless you are in conservative Catholic circles, or for some reason are kind of tuned into this stuff, you might not know anything about this. You might not know anything about these people. You probably are not aware of the kind of rhetoric that they are promoting in society, and the very real harm, unfortunately, that their teachings and perspectives are causing and having in people's lives. It's really, really unfortunate. And so I want to start getting into that all this year and going forward. The celebrity exorcist rabbit hole is one of my new rabbit holes for 2026 onward. And I decided that these series of articles that are being published right now were just a perfect way to bring everybody into it and get everybody on the same page, so to speak, before I really start to take you down the deep end. So last month we read part 1, which was Father Ripperger's bizarre and dangerous views on women, I think was the title of the article, something like that. And now this is part 2. It was published on January 6th. I was hoping I would catch it, and I did. This is published on wherepeteris.com, written by Mark Lewis. This is an analysis commentary piece, and I will be giving my opinion and commentary on what he has to say and on my perspective of Father Ripperger, Father Chad Ripperger, who is the subject of the article that we're going to be reading now. So, in part 1 of this series, Mike Lewis examined Father Chad Ripperger's public claims about women in general, that they are uniquely prone to emotional disorder, inclined toward control, and spiritually impeded by what he calls the curse of Eve. Those claims do not remain abstract. They are carried directly into his teaching on marriage, where they become prescriptions governing authority, sexuality, work, money, obedience, and even salvation. This second part focuses on Ripperger's public teachings and opinions, where his ideas cease to be theoretical and begin to impact people and families. I mean, I think I made a pretty good case in the first part that just his views on women alone stand to have a negative impact on people and families, but I digress. The Catholic Church's doctrine of marriage is demanding. It calls spouses to lifelong fidelity, self-gift, patience, sacrifice, and conversion, but it does not demand submission through humiliation, collapse consent into obligation, or baptize domination as holiness. When marriage is taught primarily as a hierarchy enforced by fear of sin, demonology, and shame, it stops functioning as a sacrament of communion and begins to operate as a disciplinary system. The stakes here are not abstract. Ordinary Catholics attempt to implement Ripperger's distorted and theologically unsound views in their lives, and real damage is done to marriage and families. The problem with Father Chad I'm just going to call him Father Chad. The problem with Father Chad's philosophy of marriage is not simply its emphasis on authority, but the persistent contempt with which wives are described, evaluated, and instructed. This is not a matter of tone or rhetorical excess. Language forms consciences. Repeated patterns of speech teach listeners what is normal, what is expected, and what kinds of suffering should be quietly endured. Across multiple talks, including those addressed explicitly to wives and mothers, women are not primarily treated as people with dignity, agency, and conscience who are united in communion with their spouses, but as risks to be managed, liabilities to be constrained, and sources of disorder, unless properly governed. And it's really, really sad to say that strains and threads and elements of this very disordered viewpoint are alive and well in probably all denominations of conservative religion, but I have my own experience with conservative Catholicism, specifically having been raised a cradle Catholic, and it's really sad to say that I saw this kind of rhetoric, maybe not quite as blatant as it is here, but I was exposed to these kinds of things. I heard these kinds of things through the church communities and the environment that I was raised in. I was raised in a very conservative Catholic environment. And so a lot of this is not really news to me. In a talk titled Spiritual Warfare in Marriage, available on YouTube, and he has the video linked, Chad frames sexual relations within marriage almost entirely in terms of obligation and enforcement. If one of the spouses reasonably asks for the conjugal act, it must be rendered, he says. Otherwise, it's mortally sinful to deny that request. He continues, after the marriage, it's no longer a gift, it's an obligation. Your contract didn't say, I'll render the marital debt when I feel like it. In this framework, consent as an ongoing moral reality effectively disappears. What remains is entitlement backed by the threat of mortal sin. And there is a larger conversation to be had here about the concept of consent within conservative Catholicism as a whole, and how it really, at least when I was growing up, didn't really seem to exist as a concept and wasn't spoken about really at all. This logic becomes more disturbing when Chad addresses situations in which a wife refuses sex. In the same talk, he explicitly dismisses a headache as a legitimate reason to refuse the marital act. On the other hand, a headache doesn't suffice. Sorry, I got a headache. While he allows that extreme incapacity might justify refusal, the baseline posture is one of suspicion. A woman's explanation is treated as morally meaningful in itself, but as something to be evaluated for compliance. This is not how the Catholic Church understands marital intimacy, which must always remain free, mutual, and expressive of love, rather than enforced under threat of sin. Now, I want to make sure and acknowledge the fact here that the Catholic Church's stance on marriage can be seen as rather controversial, depending on how you perceive it or how you view the Catholic Church in general. But if you are a Catholic and you want to live your life according to what the Catholic Church teaches, it's really important to emphasize that what Chad Ripperger is advocating for does not reflect church teaching in any way, shape, or form. And people may have issues with church teaching on marriage, and that's, a conversation for another time, definitely. But just within the construct of Catholicism, what Chad has to say is untrue and is not reflective of the church's teaching on marriage. Ripperger enforces this coercive framing by rejecting covenantal language in favor of a narrowly contractual account of marriage. Quote, marriage is defined as a solemn contract, not a covenant, he states, adding that it is a contract precisely because it involves a conferral of bodily rights. That's a stretch. He contrasts this with what he portrays as a post-Vatican II shift away from what he calls the obligation of justice. When marriage is framed primarily as a contract governing access to another person's body, a transactional approach emerges. Treating sexual availability as something owed rather than freely given creates conditions in which coercion can be rationalized as fidelity. Beyond condemning a spouse who refuses to render the marital debt, which is such a gross thing to say, Ripperger offers no guidance about how to respond when one spouse does not consent to sex. At around the 20-minute mark of his talk, he simply reiterates his beliefs about the obligatory nature of the marital contract, framing reluctance or refusal by one spouse as the product of demonic suggestion rather than as a morally significant situation requiring discernment, patience, and sacrifice. Here's the block quote here. Quote, the demons suggest to people various things which make them think they have sufficient reason to deny the marital debt. He's not being romantic, therefore you can deny the marital debt. Or they tend to think that rendering the marital debt after marriage is something that's voluntary. Well, in a certain sense it is, because you have to choose to actually fulfill your obligations, but it's not voluntary in the sense that after you're married, that somehow or another it's at your discretion when you pass when you pass out this good, so to speak. It's not voluntary in the sense that you're married, that after you're married, that somehow or another, it's at your discretion when you pass out this good, so to speak. So that's an important fact. You'll hear the phrase gift of self. Now that phrase can actually have a legitimate meaning. Gift means it's gratuitous, that you don't have to give it, which means it's only true on the day of your marriage. That's the day when the gift itself occurs. After that, it's a gift. It's an obligation. And the demons have subtly pushed this idea that, well, since it's a gift, I can just say whenever I want to and when I don't. What is striking here is not only what Ripperger says, but what he does not say. He does not state that a husband must respect his wife's refusal in all circumstances. He does not acknowledge consent as a continuing moral reality within marriage. He does not caution against coercion, manipulation, or the misuse of authority. The absence of such qualifications leaves open the possibility that obligation will be interpreted unilaterally, particularly by listeners already inclined toward control. And I can tell you, having done the research, that Chad is not talking to newcomers. He is speaking to a very specific audience within conservative Catholicism. And I would wager to guess that that sector that he is addressing are already primed to receive what he is saying as a statement of fact. In this framework, the risk is not merely theoretical. Emphasizing sexual obligation without explicit limits or safeguards can create conditions in which coercion is rationalized as duty and resistance is interpreted as sin. In the most serious cases, such reasoning can be invoked by abusers to excuse sexual abuse, including marital rape, not because these acts are endorsed, but because the moral language needed to name and resist them is never applied. When a priest's public teaching omits clear prohibitions against coercion while stressing obligations in absolute terms, it raises legitimate concerns about how that teaching may be received and applied in vulnerable situations. This omission is especially notable when Chad's approach is compared with other faith-based hierarchical or patriarchal models, which at least attempt to articulate boundaries or warnings against abuse. In Ripperger's account, marriage is presented through abstract categories: first principles, right reason, natural law. Oh my gosh, don't even get me started on natural law. That is a whole separate kind of little rabbit hole that is directly connected to this one and underpins so much of the rationale for how Chad views the world. All of this applied without sustained attention to power imbalances or the potential for grave harm. Obligation is defined without precision. Protection from potentially dangerous and abusive situations is not. At the best, this type of thing, treating sex within a marriage as something that you have to do, as this obligatory act that you must perform anytime the other person wants it, at best is going to torpedo your sex life, I would think, because that's just not, it's not the kind of thing. Intimacy does not thrive under like a pressure vacuum kind of thing, right? It needs space, it needs tender care, it needs acceptance in order to flourish and to become something that you can share with another person. Like, none of this is going to encourage that kind of thing in a marriage, which is just really, really sad. The disrespectful way Chad speaks about women, it is so incredibly disrespectful. You can tell that he really thinks that like women are like maybe one cut above demons. And the disrespectful way that he speaks about us becomes even more explicit in a separate talk addressed to wives and mothers, also posted publicly on YouTube. By the way, the vast majority of the problematic things that Chad and his goon squad have said, the vast majority of the problematic things that they have said are in audio visual format. Most of the written stuff has already been removed from the internet, actually, and so it's down to these videos, talks and things that he's given that have been recorded, or interviews that have been clipped and posted on TikTok or whatever. That's where you find his like actual perspective and the reality of how he views the world, and it's an interesting one. In this video, he advises men considering marriage, quote, "I always tell guys who are thinking about marrying, marry a virtuous woman. I don't care how ugly she is. I don't care if you have to put a lamb chop around her face to make her appealing. If she has virtue, you'll be happy the rest of your life." He offers this line without explanation, distancing, or pastoral framing. So, whatever the hell that is supposed to mean. This remark is striking not only for its cruelty, but for its bizarre and unexplained reliance on pop culture references. The lamb chop image echoes a joke popularized by comedian Rodney Dangerfield. "When I was a kid, I was so ugly, my parents would tie a pork chop around my neck so that the dog would play with me." And the closing phrase, "You'll be happy the rest of your life," evokes the lyrics of Jimmy Soul's chart-topping 1963 novelty hit, The Ugly Wife Song. Ripperger does not acknowledge these sources, nor does he explain why he is importing mid-century stand-up comedy and novelty music tropes into a clerical setting that carries moral authority. The effect is to normalize ridicule of women's bodies as harmless humor within spiritual instruction. Well, I mean, if the last time that Chad was paying attention to pop culture references was 1963, I think we know why things are so regressive and why there's so little development in the prefrontal cortex. I mean, the thing may just be like completely calcified at this point. In 1963, between 1963 and 2026, things have changed a lot, especially just in regard to how women are perceived in society, the freedoms that we're given, the rights that we have. All of that has changed a lot since 1963. So I think we may be narrowing in on a bit of a problem here. In the same talk, Ripperger frames motherhood itself as a kind of aesthetic loss. Women actually end up, usually, in the normal course of things, sacrificing a certain degree of their beauty because they're having children. He says, the issue is not acknowledging that pregnancy and childbirth changes bodies, it's the evaluative frame. Beauty is something women sacrifice, something men lose, something to be endured rather than honored. Desire, attraction, and affection for one's spouse are treated as trivial or suspect, while women are subtly instructed to expect diminishment as part of their vocation. And where have we heard that kind of rhetoric before? I mean, it's everywhere. This rhetoric is part of a broader pattern in which women are held disproportionately responsible for the emotional and spiritual health of the household. In the same Wives and Mothers talk, Chad claims that the wife and the mother can either break or make the tenor of a household and insists that if the wife is not virtuous, nobody will be happy. The moral burden of harmony is placed squarely on the wife, while male withdrawal or disengagement is implicitly normalized as a response to female failure. This is such bad advice. This is so going to cause so many problems, has caused so many problems in people's marriages and lives. I mean, let's just take for a moment, consider, what we would think of as like a typical conservative Catholic household, especially in, modern day America, right? You're probably talking about single income household. You're probably talking about multiple children, 5 plus. You're probably talking about homeschooling is a very real possibility, or at the very least Catholic school or something like that, which is going to be expensive, going to cause a strain on the finances. I mean, simply clothing and feeding multiple children will put quite a strain on the finances. Having children is not cheap. If it's a single income household, that means the husband and father, who is already, as we're reading here, being encouraged to withdraw and disengage from the family, is going to be gone out of touch, which means that the majority of the responsibility for taking care of the house and meeting the daily needs of the children is going to be squarely on the mother. And there's been much written and said about the unpaid labor that women provide in the household and how unappreciated that is in general. Well, this kind of thing is really contributing to it. And it's sad because it doesn't have to be this way at all. And why it's so important for this kind of rhetoric to be encouraged and for it to continue to be bandied about by people like Chad and those of his ilk. It truly boggles the mind. It's either they have been drinking the Kool-Aid for so long that they really and truly believe the things that they're saying, or they're smart and they realize that a lot of this stuff shakes down to a population of people who can't make decisions in their day-to-day lives and are living in fear and are going to be constantly looking to the reliable authority figure in their life to tell them how they're supposed to be living their lives. And people like Chad position themselves in that status as authority figure and know-it-all, and they dispense this apparently well-informed wisdom to their audiences, and it helps sell books and sell talks and sell courses and funnel more people into the money-making system, which when you break it down to brass tacks and you really look at how the whole thing operates, these people, where they're coming from, how the whole thing works, it feels like it's a money-making scheme. To me, is the perspective that I have of it. And maybe it's to keep a scared captive audience of people who will always be willing to shill out for whatever new thing it is that these crackpots cook up and publish as literature, Chad's language also normalizes economic dependence and verbal humiliation. He speaks derisively of women who work outside the home. Quote, "I've never met a woman who works full-time when she doesn't need to who's happy." What? I've never met a woman who works full time when she doesn't need to, who's happy. I think that's a misquote. I'm not really sure what that's supposed to say. But regardless, at another point, he goes further, suggesting that if men had properly asserted themselves earlier, they would have told women to shut your yap and go home and take care of the children. Nice. At around the 450 mark in the video, and this is not a theological argument about vocational discernment. It is crude, dismissive language that trains listeners to associate female speech with disorder and male preferences with authority. Now, I feel like this is a perfect opportunity for me to address what I have people belly aching in the comment sections of my content over often, which is the fact that I speak very bluntly. And I am not opposed to the use of profanity to punctuate the points that I am trying to make. People get very upset about that. And look, I get it. If you don't want to use profanity in your day-to-day life, that is your damn prerogative, and I support it. But I am going to, especially when I'm talking about people like this who clearly think so little of the world, think so little of their fellow man. Why would I waste my time and waste my precious brain power coming up with respectful ways to refer to these clowns when I can just call them fucking clowns and be on with my day? I give respect where respect is earned. And the people that I talk about, unfortunately, have not earned my respect, which is why I'm talking about them. I wouldn't be talking about them if they were respectful, upstanding people. So I understand the outrage and the pearl clutching, but you can keep it to yourself. I'm going to talk about these issues with the plain language that they deserve. I'm going to use the correct terminology. No unaliving over here. No murmur over here. And I'm going to do so bluntly. Very fucking bluntly. And if you don't like it, you don't have to listen. You can leave. Or you can leave a comment telling me about how much it pisses you off. Because either way, it's engagement, baby. So thank you. But why would I waste my time speaking nicely about people like this who think that it's okay to tell men to tell their wives to shut your yap and go home and take care of the children? Why? He doesn't deserve it. He hasn't earned it. He's an old, bald man with way too many opinions. And he scared a lot of people into following him. And I'm going to look forward to dismantling that brick by brick. Throughout these talks, women's resistance is consistently pathologized. Oh, I am sure Chad would say that I am just tore up from the floor up with the demon of Eve or whatever. The Jezebel spirit. I am sure. He'd probably tell me that I should be locked up because I'm crazy. Because I don't think that the things that he has to say are worthwhile or worth hearing or beneficial in any way. When women object to control, question authority, or assert boundaries, their response is rarely treated as morally intelligible disagreement. Instead, it is diagnosed as evidence of Eve's curse, feminist ideology, or spiritual disorder. Yes, how dare we stand up for ourselves and demand that we be treated as equals in this world? How dare we? Once resistance is framed in cosmic terms, disagreement becomes rebellion and assertiveness becomes sin. This is a classic feature of spiritually coercive systems. Harm is reinterpreted as holiness and obedience is sold as safety. This is something we've seen in Opus Dei, something we've seen in accounts from the Legionaries of Christ, something we've seen in accounts from the Sodality of Christian Life, something we've seen in accounts from Mila's Jesu, accounts from Mila's Christi. Shall I keep going? Accounts from the world of Ripperger et al. What is striking about all of this is how impersonal the rhetoric remains. Women are discussed almost exclusively as categories. wives, mothers, temptations, sources of control, rather than as concrete persons. These talks do not speak about women as companions or equals. This is not tradition. Catholic tradition does not teach women to accept humiliation as formation or coercion as virtue. It does not instruct wives to distrust their own judgments, bodies, or instincts in the name of holiness. And it does not define sanctity as the shrinking of one person so that another's authority can expand without resistance. The rhetoric documented here is not an unfortunate excess layered on top of otherwise sound teaching. It is the foundation of Ripperger's very public message to married people. Now, he is a priest in good standing with the Archdiocese of Denver who travels the country to train priests and speak to the faithful. Ostensibly, he's paid for his trouble. And that is why his words demand serious scrutiny. That question of accountability is where part 3 will take up the discussion directly, to be continued. So big thank you to Mike Lewis for doing this series. I have referenced his work in the past. I believe he's written about the Legion of Christ as well, and his website where Peter is, or where he publishes his work, I don't know if he owns it, but this site is great, and it's got some really good information on it, and if you've never checked it out, I highly recommend. And I will be keeping my eyes peeled for part 3 when it comes out, and we will be continuing our analysis and commentary on Ripperger et al., which is going to continue to develop in the months ahead, so stay tuned. Alrighty, we are moving through the articles here. Let me see how many I've got left. We got a few, just a small handful, but we're making really good time. I've been trying to pare down my list so that the newsroom analysis isn't quite as long as it was in the beginning. I mean, I just cannot go for hours and hours and hours, and I don't really think anybody wants to listen to that either, so I've been trying to make sure to include the articles that I think are actually relevant, that people will care to see. So let me know what you think down below, if what I have pulled so far has been relevant in your view too. But this is from El Salto, community of Madrid. Says from the pulpit to the polls, the rise of the neo-Pentecostal church as a workhorse of the extreme right. So again, this is an article that was published in Spain, but you know, I talk a lot about patterns and I talk a lot about global trends, and there is a very real sort of global shift to the like alt-right or extreme right or just like conservative identity politics in general that's happening around the world, but I think particularly in the United States, Latin America, and Spain. So I wanted to read this article because what they have to say, I think, it's educational and enlightening, and if you're an American, I think you should be able to draw some parallels pretty easily between what's happening here versus what's happening there, and try to become more informed people in the world. So the subheading says, in Spain, the PP of the region of Murcia and the community of Madrid has been approaching neo-Pentecostal evangelical religious leaders for years to try to make electoral gain to a growing phenomenon. Vox, Make Yourself Hear, or Opus Dei also participate in the global fabric that boycotts the progressive agenda. So this was written by Alberto Mesas on 18th of January. Let me see if I can shrink this font just a little. Is that too much? I don't want you guys not to be able to see it. Okay, we'll keep it huge. Family, order, and traditional values, religion, neoliberalism, and far-right politicians. This combination of concepts has always been present in the ecosystem of the reactionary right, but in the last decade, a common denominator has appeared that connects them: evangelism, and more specifically, the neo-Pentecostal branch, its most ultra-conservative aspect. The global rise of the far right and the social changes that are leading to it find a chamber of resonance in evangelism, which is transforming religious maps, especially in Latin America. Until the 1980s, the continent was the strongest stronghold of Catholicism worldwide, with more than 90% of the population declaring themselves Catholic. However, by the middle of 2010, that percentage had fallen by more than 30%. Pablo Seman has been researching the evangelical world since the 80s. He is an anthropologist and sociologist researcher of the National Council of Scientific and Technical Research of Argentina. Seman says that evangelical expansion has been coming from 1900 throughout Latin America. What happens is that it started from percentages so low that growth was not noticed until they were 9 or 10%. But that involved multiplying by 10 the number of evangelicals in a very specific context that was one of lack of religious pluralism and total dominance of Catholicism. Seman emphasizes that it is religious openness and the consolidation of democracies in Latin America that most favored the expansion of evangelism. At the head of this transformation is Brazil, but in other countries such as Argentina, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, evangelicals have become a substantial part of the population, with percentages of believers reaching 40% in some cases. The key to this phenomenon is the emergence and expansion of neo-Pentecostalism, characterized by its decentralized and local organization, which has allowed exponential growth in slums and impoverished population strata. On this, Seman speaks of two main reasons that explain evangelical growth. One of them is that in historical Pentecostal beliefs, the idea that the miracle is the order of the day tunes deeply with popular religiosity. The researcher explains that while Catholicism abandoned the idea of the miracle and secularized it, evangelicals remain in an idea of the miracle as an ordinary fact, and with that, they really tune into the population of popular origin. The second reason the expert alludes to explain the growth of the reading is hard sometimes. The second reason the expert alludes to explain the growth of evangelism is that every evangelical has the possibility of becoming a priest regardless of his marital status or gender. This idea of universal priesthood has enormous organizational consequences because it allows evangelicals to grow by fractionation, while the Catholic world is pyramidal and vertical. That's interesting. Evangelical churches also offer social support networks and a sense of belonging in contexts where other institutions have receded or perceived as absent. This makes congregations work in many urban neighborhoods as centers of social cohesion and identity. In much of the United States and Latin America, evangelism has transcended the strictly religious sphere to become a decisive electoral factor, acting as an organizational structure capable of mobilizing millions of voters and shaping political discourse. Brazil is the paradigmatic case of the evangelical political machinery. The support was key in Jair Bolsonaro's victory in 2018, with more than 65% of evangelicals voting for him in the presidential runoff. Evangelical activism in Brazil does not stay within churches. Its strategy encompasses open support for candidates, direct negotiation with political parties, and the promotion of its own representatives. In the Brazilian Congress, there is even an evangelical bench that brings together dozens of legislators from different political formations with a common agenda focused on conservative values and the defense of religious interests in the public space. Now, it's worth mentioning, while they might not present in the same way, we have similar structures here in the United States that function in a similar way, bringing people together with a common agenda focused on conservative values and also the defense of religious interests in the public space. I mean, that has been Leonard Leo's shtick for a really, really long time, and the people that he works with. So I just wanted to mention that. However, Pablo Seman qualifies that the evangelical vote and the political behavior of the evangelical representatives are neither homogeneous nor continuous, and recalls that there are sectors of evangelism that have also supported, although not so much mostly, progressive candidates in Brazil, such as Lula da Silva or Dilma Rousseff. However, the researcher adds that in the Latin American case, the right has been able to detect the keys of questioning of the evangelical world, and to the left, not so much. Quote, the affinity between the right and the evangelicals is not necessary, essential, total, or absolute, but it does tend to be so, since that the left refuses to include the evangelicals in their political strategy. In the United States, evangelism especially white Protestantism, has also been a pillar of support for the Republican Party since the late 20th century, and especially in Donald Trump's reelection. In Brazil, local churches and evangelical leaders act as centers of political socialization, spreading messages about national identity, traditional values, and expanding hate speech and fear to the left, especially the narratives of feminism, migrants, and LGBTQ rights. If you are looking for some content talking about this kind of thing, talking more about evangelical Christianity's influence in North America right now, then I highly recommend the Tim and April show. It's on YouTube, and I think it's also probably distributed through podcasting platforms and stuff too. I usually watch it on YouTube, but Tim and April are former conservative evangelical Christians who left evangelical Christianity and now are working to educate people about it and inform people, and they have a bi-weekly show that they publish, and it's really informative, and I've learned a lot just about evangelical Christianity in politics and in this country and everything. So I wanted to throw that out there if you're not familiar with their work. Although to a much lesser extent, Spain is no stranger to the expansion of the phenomenon of Pentecostal evangelism. For decades, migratory dynamics, mainly from Latin America, have transformed the religious landscape of large cities such as Madrid or Barcelona and regions such as Murcia, where evangelical churches not only grow in number, but also begin to play an important role in local politics. The evangelical boom has not gone unnoticed by the PP of Madrid. During the pre-campaign of the municipal and regional elections of 2023, several party leaders carried out a deliberate strategy of approaching evangelical churches to try and channel support between the faithful of migrant origin and their social networks. Figures from the regional and municipal PP, such as Jose Luis Martinez Almeida, Isabel Diaz Ayuso, or Alberto Nunez Fiejo himself, participated in meetings with pastors and evangelical communities. And I would have to go back and double check the particulars, but I know for sure that Jose Luis Martinez Almeida and I believe also Isabel Diaz Ayuso have ties to Opus Dei. Jose Martinez Almeida is connected to the celebrity psychiatrist Enrique Rojas Montes, who's a celebrity doctor figure over in Spain and who I did an entire deep dive on last year, if you're interested in checking that out. Anyway, I digress. The most important event was one that took place in the Madrid neighborhood of Usera. Under the slogan, Europe is Hispanic, the popular leaders appeared alongside Yadira Maestre, preacher and founder of the Christ Come Center and key figure of Pentecostalism in Spain. Years earlier, Ayuso expressly created the Secretariat of New Madrid and put the Venezuelan Gustavo Eustache in charge. Eustache is currently a deputy in the Assembly of Madrid, but the reason for Ayuso to create a position is better explained knowing that it is very well related to the main evangelist pastors of the region, as is the case of Yadira Maestre, defined by the Deputy Electoral Secretary of the Madrid PP, Jorge Rodrigo, as, quote, the agglutinator of the evangelical churches of the Community of Madrid. With this, the PP tries to build bridges with the neo-Pentecostal communities of Latinos that until now had been off the radar of conventional political strategies. In that 2023 election campaign, the strategy resulted in weeks of appearances in evangelical temples and encounters with their leaders. So pay attention. This is how it comes from grassroots up. And you can see that in the United States and in Spain and in Latin America. And I've talked about numerous cases throughout Latin American history in different countries in Latin America where grassroots movements were sort of inserted early on so that later on down the line, when other key players were in place, there was sort of a grassroots support network already in place. However, these practices do not like the evangelical world all over. When the PP of Madrid campaigned with Christ Comes in 2023, the Federation of Evangelical Religious Entities of Spain published a statement showing its disagreement with one of its churches having meant politically. Ooh, the girls are fighting. The head of the press of the entity, Jorge Fernandez, assures that, quote, no individual or political organization must arrogate the representation of evangelical community, and reaffirms the commitment of FEREDE to the principle principle of separation between church and state. Quote, the spiritual and universal nature of the evangelical church demands that its ministers and leaders avoid identification with partisan positions and preserve political neutrality in their congregations. Scrolling through the last bit of this, it's a very long article, so if you want to read this last bit of it here, you can find it down below, because they go into more detail about some of these different NGOs over in Spain. But here's something interesting. So they're talking about the phenomenon of neo-Pentecostal evangelism is not confined to the borders of each country, but has powerful transnational tentacles through which the ultra agenda is organized and spread. To do so, they resort to private financing, the creation of think tanks, fake NGOs, and business alliances. I took an issue with the whole concept of think tanks back when I did some research into Opus Dei's involvement in politics in Latin America and places like Chile, for example. And I have a very dubious perspective on think tanks, honestly, because I think that they're just the truth is in the name. They gather people together for mobilization. But anyway, I guess whether or not you're okay with that would depend on what they're mobilizing for. The best known example of this internationalization is the World Congress of Families, WCF, a U.S. organization with a presence in more than 80 countries, including Spain, where they have already held some events that coordinate strategies and discourses around the traditional family, quote unquote, in opposition to abortion. The WCF organizes regional congresses that bring together organizations, religious leaders, and even political representatives to spread ideological frameworks that translate into political pressure, global support networks, and the passage of laws in accordance with their interests. In parallel, multiple organizations, most of them Americans, such as the Alliance Defending Freedom or Family Watch International, fund the presence in coordinated actions in Europe, Africa, and Latin America to expand their narratives of religious freedom and family values. The Alliance Defending Freedom is one of Leonard Leo's dark money groups, and it was heavily involved in overturning Roe v. Wade here in this country, and they're heavily involved with working to just erode the separation of church and state in the United States completely. And I have some research that I'll be publishing soon about that. I've been looking into that a little bit more, and it's very, very interesting. And it's interesting that, but of course, I suppose it stands to reason, they're not landlocking their activities to just the United States. They are funding stuff going on globally across the Atlantic and around the world. So this is not some simple little system of, like, you know, podunk people who just came together because they like conservative religion or something. This is a well-funded, orchestrated, organized venture from every single possible perspective. So it says that the work identifies 5 key Spanish actors in this ultra framework, and this is what we'll conclude this article with. There is Vox, along with its Descenso Foundation, the Haste Or and Citizen Go platforms, Opus Dei, who they mention specifically, and the Political Network for Values, PNFV, which combine political, educational, media, and organizational resources to import and export discourses and tactics against sexual and reproductive rights. Now, I have not yet done any research into this Political Network for Values, but I would be very, very interested to see if Opus Dei has an affiliation of some sort, through some board member sitting somewhere or someone speaking at an event or something like that. I'll have to do some research in my own time. Or you can, if you would like to know. It's very, very easy. It's very easy to look into these organizations and determine if there is some type of a relationship there. And sometimes the relationship is as simple as they share ideological similarities. That's all it takes. Because, you know, if you've been here for a while, you will be aware of the fact that my perspective on Opus Dei is that it functions less like this army with one person, like one general commanding the troops, and more like a very sophisticated pipeline for just funneling people of similar ideological perspectives who are willing to put time and energy into Opus Dei's missions, which, Gareth Gore identified very well in his book Opus as, the acquisition of more funds and power. Money and power. So anyway, wanted to touch on this and bring your attention to the discourse overseas, just because I think it's interesting. I think we can see the parallels very easily. I mean, as this article even points out, the ties between what's happening here and what's happening there, they're not hard to find. They're not vague. They're very easy to establish. I mean, organizations like the ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom, are funding things overseas in other countries. If you're not an American and you're watching this, how do you feel about that? About a about a United States, because North America's a continent. The United States organization, some type of political action organization, coming into your country to bring funds and influence to further this type of rhetoric in your country. I'm not happy about it in my country, so I can't imagine that you are very happy about it in yours. Unless I have some people watching here who are very much in support of this kind of thing, but I find that hard to believe. I don't know why you'd be watching me. All right, moving on, and we are getting down to the end here. Let's see. So this, let's see. This is an article that was published in the Detroit News, and because of a name that was mentioned in here, I had to know what it said. And I will have you know that I paid to get behind the paywall for this article. I could not find a way around it. I gave the Detroit News some money so that I could read this article. So, Mr. Donnelly, I hope you are able to do something with my funds. But because of the headline, because of the name that was mentioned in this article, I had to know what was going on here. And I had to see behind the paywall. So I'm going to bring you guys behind the paywall too. Because the headline to this article is very interesting. It says, Detroit-based exorcist goes on defense after credentials questioned. I always think it's so timely. Sort of a evidence of divine timing, if you will, how, and this has happened more than once, it's almost as if the minute that I decide to focus on a new rabbit hole or a new aspect of a rabbit hole that I've been down for a while or whatever, there will, that same week or within a very close time frame of me making that decision, there will be something that hits the news somewhere pertaining directly to the thing that I am getting ready to get into. And this is a perfect example of this. This was published January 21st. And it says that during a spurt in exorcists in the United States, a Detroit priest has made a name for himself. The Reverend Carlos Martins co-hosts a popular podcast about exorcisms and, in 2024, wrote what he hoped would be a bestseller about the practice. But that was before he was accused of not being an exorcist at all. And so this is him right here, Carlos Martins. Kyle Clement, and this was the name that jumped out at me, a longtime aide of another prominent exorcist, and that exorcist is Father Chad Ripperger, said he wasn't aware of any records showing Martins had ever performed an exorcism. Quote, "He is not who he says he is," Clement said during a Jesus 911 podcast in 2024. "The problem that I've got with Father Carlos Martins is he's opining and talking about things he doesn't know." Well, people in glass houses may not want to throw stones, Kyle Clement, because do you know what you're talking about? I'm not convinced. By the way, Kyle Clement is not a priest, but he is an exorcist. Make that make sense. In November, Martins filed a defamation lawsuit against Clement and Jesus Romero, who hosted the podcast and also questioned Martins' credentials to expel malevolence from a person. Expel malevolence. Clement and Romero are followers of the Reverend Chad Ripperger of Keensburg, Colorado, one of the leading exorcists in the United States. Ripperger didn't appear on the podcast and wasn't named in the lawsuit. The lawsuit, filed in U.S. District Court in Detroit, said Martins wasn't required to file records of his exorcisms. It described the defendants as competitors who sought to hurt the sales of his book, The Exorcist Files. Clement and Romero declined to comment, but their lawyer defended their actions. Attorney Bill Burdett said the men were giving their opinions about a religious matter and therefore were protected by the First Amendment. Determining whether Father Martin is authorized to perform exorcisms turns entirely on the interpretation and application of Catholic faith, Burdett wrote in a pleading in the lawsuit. Burdett declined to be interviewed for this article. People might be shocked to learn how many exorcists walk among them. Once common during medieval times, they're enjoying a renaissance in the Catholic Church. The growth began with a decree by Pope John Paul II in 1999 that every diocese should have an exorcist, said Andrew Chestnut, chair of Catholic Studies at Virginia Commonwealth University. The pontiff was worried about growing paganism in the world. The United States, which has 197 Catholic dioceses, had a dozen exorcists in 2005, according to various estimates. Today, it has 180, Chestnut said, so it's shrunk. The great majority of Americans would definitely be surprised there are approximately 180 Catholic exorcists in the U.S., so that's one for almost every Catholic diocese. 197 Catholic dioceses and 180 Catholic exorcists in the U.S. alone. Despite the growth, exorcisms still aren't common. Yeah. Before performing one, priests are required to rule out other possible causes of a person's possessive-like behavior, according to church guidelines. The subjects undergo medical and psychiatric evaluations, which is where most cases end. And that is because the vast majority of the time, people who are acting crazy and spooky and like they're possessed, they're not really possessed at all. They need mental health support. They need their brain chemistry to be balanced. They need help. They need medical care, not holy water and a priest waving a cross in their face. Not going to do it. Not going to help. And in addition to not helping, it can actually do a lot of harm for a person who is not possessed, right? And we can get into the weeds on whether or not possession is a legitimate thing or not. I suppose it would depend on your belief and your perspective, and you're entitled to your religious convictions. But it's really dangerous for someone who needs mental health care, needs medical support, to come into contact with something like this, to be told that they need an exorcism or something like that, because you run the risk, and this has happened, unfortunately, of the fact that person needing help completely being missed and everybody in their life going full bore ahead with an exorcism. This has resulted in deaths and just really, really tragic situations. And I think whenever I get to talking about the rabbit hole of celebrity exorcists more generally, that is something that I will get into in more detail then. The fallout and the harm that has been caused by people not following protocol, which the Catholic Church has protocol that people are supposed to follow if someone is believed to be possessed. And as this article rightly points out, two of the first things you have to do is you have to meet with competent medical professionals who are able to evaluate a person's physical and mental health competently. And if that doesn't happen, there can be a lot of problems. So, it gets into some details here about Martins. He was an atheist while attending the University of Waterloo in the Canadian province of Ontario, and he met a group of Catholic students there whose faith seemed to make them uncommonly tranquil, he said in a 2024 podcast, Capturing Christianity. Does not mention what group this was, but I would be interested to know. He found himself drawn to the group and accompanied them on a religious retreat, which eventually began as metamorphosis from non-believer to believer. Now, look, Opus Dei is not the only religious, not even the only Catholic organization that goes on retreats. Retreats are common. Lots of organizations have them. You could probably go to a different one practically every single week if you wanted to. So, like, that's not necessarily a proof positive that he went to a retreat, that it was like Opus Dei that he came into contact with. But because of the fact that Opus Dei is so present in education, particularly higher education around universities and that kind of thing, and then it talks about how he met these people and they invited him to go on retreats and blah, blah, blah. It feels very familiar. I feel like I've heard that story before, which again, I'd be very curious to know what group this was that he came into contact with. He said he found himself, drawn to the group. At 51, he said he didn't have to wait long for his first exorcism. Shortly after his ordination in 2003, he was assigned to a parish in Houston that was responsible for all the exorcisms in the archdiocese and surrounding archdioceses. 3 local priests were so busy casting out il diavolo that they farmed out minor exorcisms, such as for haunted buildings, to the young deacon Martins. He quickly felt like he had a knack for it. It says here, Martin said that he's asked to teach priests in the United States and other countries about exorcisms. In 2023, the Vatican wanted him to mount a campaign to dispel some of the myths about the practice, he said during a 2023 podcast by the Catholic Vote Advocacy Group. The first step was creating a podcast about the ritual. It always starts with a podcast, doesn't it? Martins is the co-creator and co-host of The Exorcist Files, which uses actors to reenact the priest's exorcisms. There's a really good chance you've probably heard of it. It's very popular. The podcast, available on Apple and Spotify, has been downloaded 4 million times and is among the most popular spiritual podcasts in the U.S., according to its website. And then he wrote a book of the same title, describing some of the cases from the program, that what he loves most about exorcisms is that they allow him to help Christ rescue lost souls. But now we're questioning the Exorcist street cred. It says Clement and Romero questioned Martin's legitimacy during 3 Jesus 911 podcasts in November and December of 24. Clement is a case manager for Liber Christo, a Denver group that provides training and exorcisms for clergy and laity. During the podcast, Clement knew just about every exorcist in the U.S., but Martin's name had never crossed his desk. The Catholic Church breaks exorcists into 2 categories. One is a permanent position, while the other is temporarily appointed for individual cases. The temporary appointments must be approved by the local bishop. Martin's lawsuit said that he is in the latter group. Clement said during the podcast that appointments are documented and recorded, but that there are no documents for Martins, according to the lawsuit. He suggested the priest only heard confessions but never performed exorcisms. Quote, when he tells a story of experiences when he was an exorcist, that title simply is not, he doesn't have that credential canonically, Clement said, and so he's using the term in a non-canonical way. Well, I guess it would take one to know one, Clement, when it comes to whether someone is doing things in a non-canonical way. The 3 podcasts where Clement and Romero discussed Martins have been removed from streaming services, which is a common theme and has happened in the past. The public record definitely shows gaps in the narrative because there will be references to statements that Clement or Schneider or Ripperger or Romero or any of these other people in Ripperger et al. Controversial things that they have said have gotten pulled down. And so the shadow from the thing that they said is still there. There's still references to it in articles, blog posts, and that kind of thing, but you can't find the original source material because it got pulled down. And there's quite a bit of revisionist history going on in the narrative with Ripperger et al., in my opinion, anyway, based on the research that I've done and what I've looked at, which I am looking forward to sharing in the not-too-distant future. Martin's lawsuit said he received permissions for his exorcisms, but it wasn't mandatory to keep records of them. Romero emailed Martins to say he was aware of the priest's work with relics, but didn't know anything about his experiences as an exorcist. Apparently, Martins, he has a bunch of relics from Catholic saints that he travels around with and displays for people to come and see, basically. And Romero asked Martins when Martins became an exorcist, and which bishop bequeathed the title, and in what diocese. And Romero said, as a podcast host, he had received numerous questions about Martin's status as an exorcist and wanted to be able to answer listeners' queries. So in a terse reply, Martins ignored Romero's questions and said listeners should contact him through his relics group, Treasures of the Church, according to the lawsuit. So lots of back and forth and people not getting along well. Looming just outside the lawsuit is Ripperger, the prominent exorcist, and he does loom. He founded the Society of the Most Sorrowful Mother, a Keensburg, Colorado group of exorcists, and developed Liber Christo, whose training is based on his teachings. He's a prolific speaker and writer about exorcisms. So what's important to underline here is that Liber Christo is this method, this set of protocols, this tool that Chad created that is based on his teachings and his perspective as an exorcist. And as we've already seen, based on the other articles that I have presented talking about Chad, he kind of paints outside the lines, canonically speaking, with quite a bit of what he says. And believe it or not, that extends to Liber Christo. If you go Google Liber Christo, you'll find a website. You should take a look at it and just see what he has to say. Of course, Chad declined to be interviewed for this article, and they note that Martin's book, The Exorcist Files, ranks 37,641 on Amazon's top sellers list. I have no idea if that's good or not. During the Catholic Vote podcast in 2023, Martin said he worked on the book for several years and had his material reviewed by 25 exorcists, psychiatrists, psychologists, theologians, and philosophers. That book, if I do say so, is the greatest work that I've ever done, Martins said. So I wanted to read this story because it adds some more meat to the bones of the celebrity exorcist animal that I am introducing everybody to. Introduces you to some new names, some new little bits and pieces of information, and I just wanted to go over this here for the newsroom analysis because I feel like it's very pertinent, and I appreciate the reporting that the Detroit News is doing. Although it is too bad it was behind a paywall. All right, moving right along. And I know that this is a long one, so thank everybody for hanging in there with me. We've got this and one more article, and then we will be concluding things. But this is another important one that I wanted to make sure to go over with everyone here today. Let me scroll back up. This is from World G1. Opus Dei, What's Behind the Arm Drop Between the Conservative Group and the Vatican. This was published on January 25th. The organization has gained unprecedented status by decision of John P. II, but privileges are falling behind after changes imposed by Pope Francis. What does the pontificate of Leo hold for this controversial institution? Much questions are being asked in that vein right now. So I wanted to read this article, see if we can get a little bit of an update on the situation. In the intricate little corners of the political machine that runs the Catholic Church, a special folder has been resting for years in search of a solution. This is the case of Opus Dei, which deals with the situation of the almost century-old organization that for more than 40 years has received an unprecedented and unique privilege in the Vatican hierarchy. Such power granted is, however, with days numbered after reforms imposed by Pope Francis. In 1982, John Paul II, sympathetic to the institution, changed the organization's status as a secular institute, which, typified in 1947, recognizes organizations whose members follow the Catholic faith but do not renounce common practices of their social environment and do not close themselves in religious orders. 2. Personal prelature. Although many interpret the term personal as if it were the recognition of a closeness in the relationship with the Pope, it is not about that. Traditionally, religious institutions are linked to their diocese. Based on territoriality, they are commanded by a bishop. The diocese, in turn, respond to the Holy See. Personal prelature is not based on the locality, but on the person of the members, so the term personal. By this classification, a personal prelature does not respond to the bishop of the diocese, which is where it is based, but to its prelate, the superior leader of the organization. Even more important, Opus Dei was the only organization ever classified in this way to date, but changes determined by Francis recently withdrew the status as a personal prelature. So apparently, breaking news, Opus Dei is no longer a personal prelature. According to World Edison Viega from Bled, Slovenia, as of the 25th of January. I don't know that I knew that. I don't know how many people know that. I feel like I see it referred to as a personal prelature currently in like news media and stuff. In theory, the change granted by John Paul II would serve to reconcile the charism of the organization, which has always advocated the exercise of holiness by lay people, with the need to structure it administratively within the church. In practice, he gave Opus Dei a unique autonomy in the history of Catholicism, leaving, for example, having to give satisfaction to the bishops. It was as if the organization was considered itself a diocese. No wonder. It was also customary for the Pope to appoint the prelate of Opus Dei as a bishop. In the 1980s, in the context of the Cold War, the benefits granted to Opus Dei were interpreted as a step further to the right of Catholicism. It made sense. John Paul II was publicly opposed to socialist regimes and communist discourses. When he died, Benedict came, who did not move the pieces of the board, leaving Opus Dei with the same space. After Benedict's resignation, Francis's pontificate included the Opus Dei case on the list of what needed to be revised. According to Vaticanus, the Argentine Pope was bothered by the autonomy of the group, considered excessive by him. At the same time, he understood that no institution within Catholicism could enjoy a regime of exception. And in his reform in the Vatican's administrative machinery, Francis saw the opportunity to frame the institution. To complete the climate of tension, the Spanish priest Fernando Ocaires Branya, head of Opus Dei since 2017, was not appointed bishop by Francis as expected according to tradition. He was the first prelate of Opus Dei not to receive the title. For analysts, this was a message. Francis wanted to show that the time of privileges had ended for the organization. Theologian and historian Gerson Lede de Moraes, a professor at Mackenzie Presbyterian University, claims that Francis was an heir to the tradition of the Second Vatican Council, which took place between 1962 and 1965. The council brought to the church social issues and current issues, in addition to the discussion about the power shared with the diocese and bishops, a point that was quite evident during the pontificate of Francis, which stood as one more bishop and was open to the greater participation of the diocese. Quote, he sought to open the church to important and current issues. The Opus Dei is a retrograde force, and its legal structure allowed it to navigate the opposition direction of the Pope's effort to bring the church to these themes and to broaden the participation of dioceses, explained Moraes. Francis published 3 documents in 2022 and 2023 that imposed the need for changes in Opus Dei. First, the organization began to have to report to the dicastery for the clergy and no longer to the dicastery for the bishops. Dicasteries are administrative and thematic bodies commanded by mayors appointed by the Pope. As before, Opus Dei had a status similar to that of a diocese without territory. It responded to the dicastery for the bishops. But when he went on to report to the dicastery for the clergy, below in the chain of command focused on matters related to priests and deacons. Thus, the change of dicastery was seen as a downgrade and a loss of power. Francis also ordered Opus Dei to submit annual reports of its activities, not 5 yearly as it did before, and it made official that the institution's prelate would not automatically be appointed bishop. But the most neurologic change was in the role of the laity, that is, the members of the organization who are not consecrated religious, such as priests and nuns. In John Paul II's understanding, in common agreement with the founder of Opus Dei, the laity were understood members of the prelature. In 2023, the then Pope changed the status of Opus Dei from personal prelature to public clerical association, which presupposes a submission to the Church's hierarchy and in which there is a primacy of the clergy, although the laity may also participate. In France's reform, lay Catholics also needed to be connected to the diocese of their territories. With the new rules, the religious who was consecrated gains importance. The laity may devote themselves to the apostolic works of a personal prelature by means of conventions stipulated with the prelature itself. The method of this organic cooperation and the main duties and rights related to it are precisely determined in the statutes. The text enacted reads: Official data from Opus Dei currently count 90,000 members in the institution, the vast majority of them lay. Only 215 members are priests. The rules imposed by Francis also oblige Opus Dei to update its statutes. This has been done, but some critics understand that more slowly than the Vatican would like. Although there is no set deadline for the publication of the new statutes, everything is expected to be resolved by 2028. So that the centenary of the institution is celebrated in a more pacified context. Holy cow. That's a long time. The statute will have to define what Opus Dei will be a public clerical association, as Francis has determined. The demotion of status implies that it will be an association of members of the secular clergy who respond directly to dioceses and bishops, different from the clergy who respond to orders such as the Franciscan and Dominicans, from priests and deacons, and will be governed by statutes approved by the Church that grant legal personality and define their mission, explains political scientist Aldo Fornazzari, a professor at the School of Sociology and Politics. In this way, Opus Dei will lose its autonomy and privileges and will cease to be a church within the church, he continues. According to a note signed by journalist Jack Valero, head of communication for Opus Dei in Britain, what is being studied is how the charisma and legal dimension of Opus Dei can coexist. In recent weeks, BBC News Brazil has spoken to members of Opus Dei in 4 different countries. All requested that their names not be cited in the report, stating that official information should be given by the communication offices maintained by Opus Dei. Respondents indicated that they did not care about the question of the prelate no longer being appointed bishop. We are not concerned about domestic politics nor about hierarchy, another commented. Another point debated by the members of the organization is what may be the stance of Pope Leo, enthroned in May after Francis' death. When the current pope was simply Bishop Robert Prevost, he headed the Peruvian diocese of Chiclayo between 2014 and 2023. It is a region where there are several priests connected to Opus Dei. This, in the view of some members, could help that the conduct related to Opus Dei was more friendly than in Francis' time. Leo has already had private conversations with the prelate of Opus Dei, but nothing indicates that he will backtrack on what was determined by Francis. Even so, internally, at least some adjustments are still expected, the members claim. Fornazzari thinks a change of course under the new papacy is unlikely because Opus Dei has been causing discomfort in various Catholic segments. I mean, try in various societal segments, just generally speaking. I mean, the organization is being indicted by Argentine federal authorities for labor trafficking, which is not a new accusation. I mean, they were convicted of the same in France in 2016. And have been accused of similar behavior in places like the UK and Ireland. So it's not just Catholic sectors that Opus Dei is having an impact on. And more to that point, that's a reason why I talk about it. I mean, I'm not Catholic anymore. So on a certain level, when it comes to what the Vatican's going to do with this organization, I kind of don't have a dog in the fight anymore. It's sort of immaterial to me. I'm more concerned with what is going to happen in the civil and criminal courts, simply because I feel like at this point there is a better chance for victims to receive some sort of redress or justice in the civil and criminal courts than in any kind of canonical court. But, you know, maybe Leo is going to change everything. Maybe. But Opus Dei is everywhere, like I mentioned earlier, because of the fact that they have managed to insert themselves into every single strata of society. Then you don't have to be Catholic for this organization to potentially have an impact on you, particularly not when there are people who are affiliated with the organization who are becoming politically activated and running for public office, and then employing that mentality, that Opus Dei kind of perspective on the world to their civic duty. The impact is definitely real, and it's going to be felt by a lot of people, not just Catholics. So that's why I talk about it. And it's worth, for all that I don't have a dog in the fight for really what the Vatican does in regard to Opus Dei, I still mention it and talk about it because I know that a lot of people do. There are a lot of Catholics and former members who would really like to see some sort of accountability and some sort of something from the Vatican in regard to the whole situation with this organization. So it's not just one small sector of people, and that is why I talk about it. There is publicly no known date for the adoption process to be consummated, but there is information that the Pope would give an ultimatum. A text published on the Opus Dei website in June called the information that Pope Leo had given an ultimatum demanding speed in drafting the new statutes. The report questioned the communication department of Opus Dei, but the institution limited itself to sending a brief note to the report signed by journalist Roberto Zanin from the Brazilian office. In the text, he emphasized that the order has worked in line with the guidelines of the Holy See to adopt its statutes. Roberto Zanin said that the result of this work was delivered to the Vatican in June and that Opus awaits the approval of the Pope to, only then, grant interviews on the subject. So, we are still waiting. This article goes on to provide some historical context, which you can go and read about if you want to in your own time. That was the meat and taters, where things stand with this organization and the Vatican. That was really what I wanted to convey and present in this article. So, last but not least, in the vein of canonical processes, this was published on EWTN News on... I don't think they put a date on this article, but I saw it within the last few days. So it was within the end of January or so. Legionaries of Christ, no canonical process against founder pending at Vatican. And so by founder, they're talking about the pederast Marcial Maciel. The spokesman for the Legionaries of Christ, Father Raphael Giacome LC, announced on Saturday that the Holy See has informed the congregation that no canonical process is taking place, nor will be taking place against its founder, Father Marcial Maciel LC. The spokesman for the Legionaries of Christ, Father Raphael, announced on Saturday, yes, they're not taking no canonical process. He recalled the statements by Father Maciel of April 22nd, 2002, quote, "Before God and with absolute peace of conscience, I categorically declare that these accusations made against me are false. I have never exhibited the type of abominable behavior that these persons accuse me of, and there is nothing that could be further from my way of treating people, as any one of the thousands of legionaries who know me can confirm." Okay, you hear that? The statement underscores that the Legionaries of Christ and the members of Regnum Christi renew our commitment to serve the Church and society in total fidelity to the Catholic faith and obedience to the Supreme Pontiff and an intimate union with our beloved founder, according to the charism we have received through him. The Legion does not hold any resentment against those who accuse us. Rather, we pray for them, and we express our gratitude to the innumerable people of goodwill who have confirmed to us their support and esteem in these circumstances. The statement concludes. So, what do you think about that? It seems to me like maybe some revisionist history. And once again, and this is not new. Once again, the determination of some sort of a canonical or Vatican process ends up being the thing that these organizations, which have harbored people who have committed unspeakable atrocities against innocent, vulnerable people, children, that the final decision on the Vatican's part, regardless of what has happened in the civil or criminal courts, is the final word on the matter and the only one that matters at all. We've seen this, I've talked about this in relation to the former Opus Dei school teacher, Marie Martinez Sands, who is now a convicted pedophile. But over the last year, all of the news headlines that I was seeing were talking about all of the problems that these various people had with the canonical process that was being carried out against Maria Martinez Sands. Chief amongst them, that it was taking the civil criminal decisions and the findings of those investigations into too much consideration in determining Maria Martinez Sands' position with the Catholic Church. So I see this kind of thing. Seems like something I've seen before. Feels like, well, the Catholic Church said we're fine, so we're fine. Doesn't matter what's happened anywhere else. And they make the statement at the end, we don't have any resentment against those who accuse us. We're praying for them. We haven't done anything wrong. Yes, a bunch of our financial information and potential fraud was exposed during and after the Pandora papers. Yes, we got called out for hiding our significant wealth in overseas accounts. But we don't have any resentment. We're praying for the people who have been accusing us because, just so you know, there's no canonical process against the founder pending at the Vatican now, so everything's fine. That's how it reads to me. Let me know what you think about that. I don't know. And if you want to know more about the Legionaries of Christ and what happened with the organization and its history and everything, I have an entire deep dive episode dedicated to it. You can go and find it. I worked really hard on it, so I'd appreciate it if you did. But that brings us more or less to the end of the news headlines that I wanted to go over. There are a few mentions that I want to make sure to include at the end here. There were some people who passed away over the course of the last month, and I wanted to make a mention of their names here. The one that you probably heard about was John Allen, who was the creator of Crux, I believe. Yeah, he helped launch and he led Crux, which is a major Catholic news outlet for more than a decade. Him and his wife, Elise Ann Allen, who's a senior Rome correspondent, and he passed away on January 26 at the age of 61 after a 3-year battle with stomach cancer. So I wanted to make a mention of that. He has had a huge impact on Catholic news. I have his book right here on my shelf. He wrote a book that was supposed to be like a very comprehensive and thorough investigation into Opus Dei. I have my issues with his work, but he has left a lasting impact, and he will be remembered long after he is gone. So he passed away, and also Bishop Emeritus Pedro Pablo Elizondo Cardenas, who was a member of Legion of Christ, passed away. An Opus Dei member was tragically killed in a really awful train accident. Maria Luisa Ugi from Navarre. She was in a really fatal train accident in Cordoba, passed away. I've got to translate these real quick. Father Jose Antonio Veloso passed away. He was a member of Opus Dei and originally from Coimbra. And last but not least, Alfredo Lozada, priest of Opus Dei, passed away. So may eternal rest grant unto all of them, O Lord, and may perpetual light shine upon them. So that brings us to the end of this newsroom analysis. Not a minute too soon. I managed to keep it under 2 hours, but only just barely. So thank you so much for sitting through this with me. Links to connect with me on social media, learn more about my work, are linked down below. If you or someone that you know is in need of mental health support, I've collated some resources down below as well. Take a look. There may be something there that can help you. Please do like, subscribe, and share if you have not already. Thank you for being here, and I'll have a new video very soon for you. But in the meantime, remember, nolite te bastardes carborandorum. Don't let the bastards drag you down.